Good morning. If you can't tell, it's bitingly cold this morning. Probably going to have a shorter walk than usual today. I wanted to respond to some comments by rungavagairun. That's my best attempt at your username. I'll call you Run for short. On a recent video that I'd uploaded where I was talking about, the issues of democracy and government and all that, as I sort of usually am lately. And Run had said something to the effect that I think your perspectives on democracy and diversity are not grounded in a historical perspective. And this was in reference to something where I was saying that I think, older cultures, more primitive cultures before the time of, our very small world in terms of, distance between peoples, that these cultures were more monocultures and that there was less diversity. And I was sort of making the argument that democracy would work better in those kinds of cultures where there's less diversity of thought. My point, just to make it clearer, my point was not that I think that those cultures were democracies. I don't think that's really the case. I think, ultimately people have always been trying to control and manipulate other people. And it's quite possible with those cultures that some of that was out of necessity, like survival of the tribe sort of might have necessitated that, that everyone's kind of kept in line. So my position is not that those were democracies or that democracy was even really much of a concept then. My point was that they were less diverse. And I think that is obviously got a good historical foundation to it, that they were less diverse, and therefore there was less tension when it comes to a lot of the cultural practices and ideas and the ways that they conducted themselves than what we face in our more diverse cultures of today, where we're literally smashing cultures together and declaring it a strength, and acting like everyone should just get along. Everyone ought to get along. Even while sometimes, like our idiot Trudeau here in Canada, we're acknowledging, the sisters up in the balcony, right? So we're acknowledging, Mr. Male Feminist actually made an acknowledgement of the division in a certain culture between the sexes. He was sort of forced to, and he did it in a really awkward way. And, these are the things that display themselves. And certainly, when it comes to political diversity as well, my secondary argument to that was, when the government doesn't do much, there's not much to argue over. Over time, of course, governments are going to almost inevitably get larger because of the nature of government and the nature of again, this desire that people seem to have to control and manipulate other people. Very few people really embrace true voluntarism. Very few people actually philosophically analyze on what basis can they actually determine what other people ought to do and inevitably force them into doing so. And so you end up with these situations where you have a pretty politically diverse culture, and then you end up with people trying to wrest the levers of power for their side, and they get more and more militant, it seems, certainly lately, in trying to impose their will upon the other group of people. That's sort of my broader point. Run then said, I don't think it would be ethical or moral to try to push cultures or societies towards monocultures. And I would agree. I mean, I'm a voluntarist, so I think the only way that things like that should happen is if it happens sort of organically, if people are just driven to a certain ways of conducting themselves, ways of behaving, and interacting with people of like mind and want to move towards that. And more importantly, if they do it through voluntary interaction and argument, make a good argument. Show me why I ought to live the way you think I ought to live. Show me why I ought to do the things that you think I ought to do, etc. And, Run had said, I think you would lean towards, if you were going to push towards some kind of a monoculture, I think you would lean towards an ideological one rather than an ethnic one, although, and I would agree, it makes the most sense, but oftentimes, it's the ethnicities do seem to have more of a hive mind sometimes, so maybe that's not exactly true, but I think it's too late for that anyway, although I'm not saying it couldn't happen, that there might be some push in the future for people to push towards sort of ethno-states or something like that. And again, I think if it happened voluntarily, that would be kind of okay, organically and voluntarily. I'm not so sure that's necessarily possible because, what do you do with these, individuals or groups of people who wish to leave things as they are or wish not to move out of a region just because they're of a certain ethnicity or something like that, then you run into the problem of voluntarism. Like, what right do you have to push them out? We're all here on this ball. What right do you have to push people out of a region simply because you want them not to be there? But I do agree that, you would probably do it on an ideological basis. And then the problem becomes, of course, how do you weed people out, based on ideology? Do you have to have some kind of mass interrogations? This is what Run was saying, in order to, weed out the wrong think or whatever. He was basically alluding to a kind of a purity test. And I would submit to you that we're already living in that world. In a sense, we always have been. This even goes back to those, the primitive tribes I was referring to earlier. If it really was a situation where the safety and security of the tribe actually rests upon everybody kind of thinking more along the same lines and people not really pushing the limits too much, then you would have, those purity tests would be not so much purity tests in that sense, because it would be probably pretty apparent if someone started questioning the status quo, right? In thought or deed. It would be pretty obvious to everyone because, again, it's so much less diverse than what we have in our modern society. We're actually a little bit more used to people who are contrarians and things like that. Through the Enlightenment and whatnot, we had even at some point kind of embraced the idea of discourse and debate and challenging ideas and freedom of thought, freedom of expression. Even though I think we've sunk away from that a little bit lately, it's always kind of existed, this idea of rooting out wrongthink and the purity tests. And it depends on the cultures, obviously. You could go through them, group by group, probably through time, and find varying degrees of this. But we certainly are there now, with respect to a lot of different political situations, with respect to the trans situation, a lot of other things like that. There are groups of people who are engaging in these purity tests and dismissing and relegating people to the scrap heap of human irrelevance based on an interpretation of them being engaged in some kind of wrongthink. People very rarely these days seem to engage in the debate. They would rather just dismiss you. They would rather just relegate you to that scrap heap. And so, these purity tests are something that I think we're knee deep in it. And so I would completely agree with Run on that point. I don't think you push towards a monoculture. No, I think at some level we are all aware of this. At some level we all sort of know that the diversity is not really a strength ultimately. That the only way diversity is a strength, I think, is actually when it does form a melting pot. And governments seem to have this idea because, of course, they use the melting pot often as a political tool to convince people, for whatever reason, that they ought to allow the diversity, to accept, the immigration that the government wants. I mean, you got to notice at some point, yes, there are lots of liberals running around the United States saying that, immigrants are our greatest champion and they do all the work, and they, as Kelly Osbourne has famously said, and others too, right, that they're the toilet cleaners and whatnot. But those are people, I think, that have been politically manipulated. They're there after the fact. You don't find actually a lot of people from the West who've been petitioning the government before the fact, before the immigration. Can we get more immigrants in here? They're not really doing that. And I think, in large part, a lot of people recognize if you had an honest conversation with someone, you could get them to recognize that oftentimes what ends up happening is people move to a country that is a different culture than they're used to, and they tend to form kind of enclaves. Certainly if you bring them in any great numbers, which I think is the mistake that's being made in the West these days. And I'm referring to, all over Europe as well, Canada, the US. When you bring them in large numbers, they're going to form enclaves. That's voluntarism too, right? They're going to go where they're comfortable. And they're ultimately probably going to want to see, even if subconsciously, if they can slowly morph your country into their country. Like, that's kind of natural. This is what they know. It's what they're used to. And we kind of recognize that, I think, in a way, but we're not honest about it. Certainly the politicians are not honest about it. And by the way, with respect to immigration to some of these Western countries in particular, the constant demonization around the globe of white people, I don't think helps, obviously, because what you end up with is a bunch of people who move to your country that have disdain for you. As Tim Walz found out, a little bit ago here, as a woman, I don't know if she was a Somali, but anyway, she basically said to him, openly, that she didn't like him and that she was afraid of him because he's white. And this is happening around the West, and a lot of it is about culture as well, right? Like, there are a lot of people that move to, in particular in Europe and the UK, who, they're not exactly feminists, right? And so when they see women dressed, what they would consider to be very provocatively, might even be conservative dressed by Western standards, but certainly if they're dressed actually provocatively, they make all kinds of judgments about those females, including judgments about what it's acceptable to do to them. And at some point, we have to address this, and certainly the politicians have not. I mean, there have been scandals, specifically about assaults in some of those very countries that the police forces and the politicians have failed to address appropriately. When you have smaller amounts of immigration and you have fewer people from any other given culture or region moving to yours, then I think there is a greater likelihood that there's going to be assimilation, that they're going to blend into your country. Yes, they may not drop all of their cultural, history and things like that, nor do you really need them to, because they're not trying to change your country into their country. They recognize that, they're, for lack of a better term, they're alone here. Of course, they're not really, but they're not forming massive enclaves of people who have no need now to adopt the host country's culture at all, not even the smallest parts of it. And this is happening in the West now. There are large groups of people who don't need to assimilate almost at all. In fact, they're demanding that the country assimilate to them. And that's going to cause problems. That's going to cause conflict. And, again, I'm not saying all of this as a racist or a culturist or something like that. Obviously I do prefer the culture that I'm currently in. Not all the way. There are a lot of recent aspects in the last 20 years that I'm not pleased with, and these are not a result of any immigration either. These are the result of politics. And that's really my point, is because the immigration is a result of the politics too. That's my major point, of course, is that democracy doesn't work for those reasons, because we've become too politically diverse. And we've become too politically diverse because we've allowed the government to reach the size that it has, where there are so many things that people can try to get the government to do on their behalf that are not in the interest of certain other groups. And the politicians engage in a lot of demonization of the opposition, and so do the people on the ground. And voluntarism is much better. It really is. And also a true free market is much better, where people are kind of more on the hook. If you want to get something done, well, if it's important enough to you, then you ought to be able to raise the funds or raise enough support amongst other people voluntarily to get it done. You shouldn't be able to impose it on other people just by visiting a voting booth, just by, engaging in all kinds of really questionable practices when it comes to, gathering votes of other people and demonizing people and engaging in all this political fuckery that goes on. Not to mention, the backroom deal stuff, the lobbying, the corporatism that goes on, the collusion between government and big business, the revolving door between big business and regulatory agencies and stuff like that. I mean, it's just a complete clusterfuck. And the sooner we realize that, the better off we'll be. And the problem is, I think that in the short term, you just still have a lot of people who see the potential for short-term advantage, and they're just too weak-minded to rise above it and to recognize the problem that we have saddled ourselves with as a species. And that was my broader point. This idea, this concept of democracy sounds good. It sounds good. But really, the moment that you see a politician sort of using it as a cudgel, that ought to be your first clue. I've said before that democracy is one of the most manipulated words in the English language, right? So this is, again, one of the ways that politicians attempt to corral you, to make declarations about a threat to our democracy, protecting our democracy, spreading democracy, all of these things. Ultimately their objectives aren't really your objectives. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a truly genuine politician that's really interested in the well-being of his constituency. Even a lot of them start out that way. I don't think they necessarily end that way. I'm not saying there's no examples of it. I'm just saying it's pretty rare. Generally speaking, I think the kind of people that you would want in politics don't want anything to do with politics. And again, the problem with democracy is a basic one, right? The problem with democracy is the lack of voluntarism, because ultimately there are going to be groups of people that are left out. And at some point, again, getting back to my original video, at some point, the irony is that we acknowledge those people. and we say, oh, they were oppressed. That wasn't right what was done to them. And we champion their cause, and we sometimes even engage in all kinds of talks about how we need to have reparations of some sort, or we need to make it right. And the problem with that, of course, is we don't do that universally. It's difficult to do after the fact anyway, especially, hundreds of years after the fact. It's impossible, really, because the people who had that done to them and who did that are no longer alive. But the question becomes, who gets the acknowledgements? Because we're not honest about that either. Usually there's some current vested interest in pushing that agenda in specific areas, right? The best thing you could possibly do is engage in voluntarism as soon as possible. Let the chips fall where they may. Try to be, kind to one another, but mostly philosophically engage in the mental math of figuring out what right do you really have to impose your will on someone else. How well can you argue for what you would like them to do? And how voluntary can we really be on this planet? My cheeks are so stiff. It's crazy, I can barely talk. So I probably should stop. Please let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.